Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful sermon, one that takes some of the most famous words ever spoken and kind of flips them on their head. It argues they aren't just ancient words of comfort, but an urgent call to action for right here and right now. We've all heard these words from the Sermon on the Mount, right? They feel super familiar, peaceful, almost like a gentle prayer. It's the kind of thing you'd see on a poster. But the sermon we're exploring today, it asks us to look way, way closer. And that's the big question, isn't it? What if this wasn't just a hopeful blessing for some far-off future? What if it was a radical, political, and deeply challenging statement aimed right at the powers that be? That's the puzzle we're going to unpack. So, to really get to the heart of that challenge, we have to go back in time. We have to understand the world where these words were first heard. And let me tell you, this was no peaceful retreat. It was a total pressure cooker. Okay, so picture this. You're living in a land under foreign military occupation. The sermon describes a society with a massive wealth gap. We're talking 90% of people were just struggling to get by. It was ruled by puppet kings like Herod Antipas, who really just answered to Rome. And on top of that, people were crushed by heavy taxes and even forced labor. It was a deeply fractured and oppressive world. And the official brand name for all this control was the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. But this peace had nothing to do with justice or harmony. It was a peace kept through the constant threat of brutal, overwhelming violence. Public executions were just a tool of state policy. So when Jesus stands on a hill and says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he's offering a completely different definition of peace than the one his audience was living under every single day. And this is where the sermon makes a really bold leap. It argues that these patterns of empire and power aren't just ancient history. It draws a direct line from the struggles in first-century Judea to the anxieties of our own modern world. The sermon suggests that these dynamics just echo through time. The control through puppet kings back then is compared to modern attacks on our institutions. The extreme wealth gap of that era is mirrored in our own. And that Roman strategy of keeping control through force, that's likened to a modern tactic of sowing fear and mistrust to basically paralyze people. To really nail this point down, the sermon quotes Bill Burns, a long-serving diplomat, former head of the CIA. He wasn't talking about ancient Rome. He was talking about today. And his warning is pretty stark. The goal of these tactics is to make people afraid to challenge authority, to silence dissent before it can even get started. So, if that's the diagnosis, what's the prescription? Well, according to the sermon, it is definitely not quiet acceptance. It's a moral and spiritual demand to act, a call to what it calls nonviolent resistance. And to build this case, the sermon starts pulling from some of the great moral voices of the 20th century, starting with Martin Luther King Jr. The message here is crystal clear. Silence in the face of what you see as evil isn't being neutral, it's being complicit. Then, the sermon brings in Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously marched right alongside Dr. King. He takes it even a step further, arguing that indifference and despair, they aren't just passive feelings. They are an active surrender. You can really see the interfaith foundation the sermon is building for its argument here. And this leads to a final, sharp distinction from Reverend William Sloane Coffin. The sermon uses this quote to draw a bright line between patriotism, a love for your country and its ideals, and nationalism, which it defines as an exclusionary idea that sets one nation above others. The core belief is a universal one. God is for everyone. So, what's the point of all this resistance? The sermon is very clear. This isn't about winning a political fight or crushing an opponent. The ultimate goal, borrowing a phrase from Dr. King, is about reconciliation. It's about creating what he called the beloved community, where justice and love can actually prevail. But that raises a pretty big question. How does a person become capable of doing this kind of work? The sermon pivots here to a really crucial theological point about how spiritual transformation actually happens. And it might not be what you think. This right here is the engine of the whole idea. The sermon argues that real change, becoming a new version of yourself, it doesn't happen in isolation. It's not about sitting alone and meditating until you reach enlightenment. It is forged in the messy, complicated, beautiful business of engaging with other people. Let's break that down. First, you have to let go of the idea that this is a solo mission. Second, you have to actively seek out that change through your relationships and your actions in the world. And third, the fundamental belief here is that the divine, that spark of God, is found in those interactions, in the faces of others, in the work of the community.
And all of these ideas, the call to resist, the power of community, the need to act, they all get wrapped up in a final, powerful story that the sermon uses to make its point absolutely unforgettable.
The sermon asks us to picture this scene, taken from the writer Annie Dillard. It's a small, warm room in Scottsboro, Alabama. A revival meeting is in full swing. The energy's high, people are on their feet. And up at the pulpit is this uneducated Southern preacher named Brother Carl Porter. He's preaching, and the crowd is right there with him. And he says, God isn't some old man in the sky. He says he's a spirit. He ain't got no body. And he just lets those words hang in the air for a moment. And then he delivers the line that makes the entire room just erupt. The only body he got is US. And the place just explodes. Amen. And this, the sermon concludes, is it. That's the whole message in a nutshell. This is faith in action. The idea that if a divine call for love, for peacemaking, for justice is going to be made real in the world, it's not going to come from the clouds. It has to come through the hands, the feet, and the voices of people. Which leaves us with the final, unavoidable question the sermon poses to its listeners and now to us. If that's true, what is that body? What are we being called to do right now, today?